The morning mist clung to the Montana wilderness like a shroud, and somewhere within those dense pine forests, a man and his horse had simply vanished. No trace, no explanation, just an empty saddle and a mystery that would haunt the mountains for years to come. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. October 15th, 2019. The sun painted the Glacier National Park landscape in shades of amber and gold as Ranger Jake Sullivan prepared for what should have been a routine patrol. At 42, Jake had spent nearly 2 decades navigating these treacherous mountain trails, and his chestnut gelding, Thunder, had been his faithful companion for the last 8 years. Together, they were an inseparable team, man and beast, moving as one through the wilderness they both called home. The ranger station buzzed with morning energy, coffee brewing, radios crackling, boots on wooden floors. Jake's supervisor, Chief Ranger Maria Gonzalez, watched as he adjusted Thunder's saddle with meticulous care. The leather creaked softly, and Thunder's breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. "Sector 7 today, Jake," Maria called out. "Storms rolling in around 4 p.m., so be back before then." Jake nodded, his weathered hands running one final check over Thunder's gear. The horse's distinctive horseshoes, custom-made with Jake's initials JS, stamped into the metal, caught the morning light. It was a small vanity, but in the vastness of Montana's wilderness, every detail mattered. Every precaution could mean the difference between life and death. Thunder's ears twitched as they approached the trailhead. The horse seemed restless. His nostrils flared, catching scents Jake couldn't detect. Was it the approaching storm, or something else lurking in the shadows? "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice steady despite the strange unease that had settled in his chest. He'd learned to trust Thunder's instincts over the years. The horse had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it revealed itself. At 7:43 a.m., Jake's radio crackled to life as he called in his departure. "Base, this is Ranger 7, beginning patrol of Sector 7. ETA return 1500 hours. Maria's voice came back clear and reassuring. "Copy that, Jake. Stay safe out there." Those would be the last words anyone at the ranger station would ever hear from Jake Sullivan. As Thunder's hooves struck the familiar rhythm against the mountain trail, neither man nor horse could have imagined they were walking into a mystery that would consume the Montana wilderness for years to come. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting for something that even the most experienced ranger couldn't have anticipated. But what really happened that October morning? And why would it take years before a single, rusty horseshoe would finally begin to unlock the truth? The clock on the ranger station wall ticked past 3:20 p.m., and Maria Gonzalez felt the first knot of worry form in her stomach. Jake was always punctual, obsessively so. In 18 years, he'd never missed. A check-in without good reason. She reached for her radio, the familiar weight of it somehow heavier in her hands. Static filled the air as she adjusted the frequency, scanning through the channels with practiced efficiency. Outside, dark clouds gathered like vultures, circling prey, the promised storm arriving earlier than forecasted. "Ranger 7, this is base. Come in, Jake." Her voice echoed through the empty station, met only by the whisper of static. She tried again, her tone sharper now. "Jake, respond, please." Nothing. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending pine needles dancing across the parking lot. Maria's fingers drummed against her desk as she calculated the time. Jake should have been heading back by now. even if he'd stayed until his scheduled 3 p.m. departure from Sector 7. By 4:30 p.m., the storm hit with the fury that only Montana mountains could deliver. Rain lashed against the station windows, and lightning split the sky like fractured glass. The power flickered once, twice, then held. Maria had moved to the large topographical map mounted on the wall, her finger tracing the route Jake would have taken through Sector 7. The sector covered nearly 30 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in the park. Deep ravines carved by ancient glaciers, dense pine forests that could swallow a man whole, and rocky outcroppings, where a single misstep could prove fatal. It wasn't unusual for rangers to take shelter during severe weather, but Jake would have radioed in. Other rangers began filtering back to the station, their rain-soaked gear dripping puddles across the wooden floors. Tom Bradley, a veteran ranger, with 25 years of experience, shook the water from his hat as he approached Maria's desk. "Any word from Jake?" he asked, though the expression on Maria's face already provided the answer. She shook her head, her dark eyes reflecting the concern that had been building all afternoon. "Nothing since this morning. He was supposed to patrol the northern trails in Sector 7. Tom studied the map, his weathered finger following the same path Maria had traced dozens of times. "That's rough country in weather like this. Could be holed up in one of the emergency shelters." But even as he said it, both rangers knew Jake would have found a way to communicate. The emergency shelters were equipped with backup radios for exactly this situation. As the storm raged through the night, Maria made the decision that would mark the beginning of one of Montana's most baffling mysteries. At dawn, she would organize a search party. 3 other rangers volunteered immediately, their faces grim with understanding. In the wilderness, time was everything. The first 48 hours could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. What they couldn't know was that they were already too late. Somewhere in the vast expanse of Sector 7, Jake Sullivan and Thunder had encountered something that defied explanation. The forest had swallowed them both, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the Montana wilderness for years to come. But what force could make both a man and a 1,200-pound horse disappear without a trace? Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Glacier National Park. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Fallen branches littered the trails like broken bones, and the air carried the sharp scent of ozone and wet earth. Maria Gonzalez stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching 4 experienced rangers prepare for what everyone hoped would be a simple rescue mission. Tom Bradley loaded his backpack with methodical precision. Emergency medical supplies, GPS, equipment, extra batteries for the radios, and enough food for 2 days. His movements carried the weight of too many search operations, too many times when preparation meant the difference between bringing someone home alive or carrying them out in a body bag. The search area was divided into quadrants. Each team would cover a specific section of Sector 7, following Jake's most likely route while searching for any sign of the missing ranger and his horse. Sarah Chen, a newer ranger with expert tracking skills, studied the topographical maps with intense focus. "Weather could have washed away tracks," she observed, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that came with experience in wilderness. "Rescue. But a horse leaves different signs than a man on foot. Broken branches, disturbed vegetation, hoof prints in protected areas." The teams set out at first light, their radios crackling with periodic check-ins. The forest felt different. In the aftermath of the storm, quieter somehow, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Maria coordinated from base camp, a temporary command post they'd established at the Sector 7 trailhead where Jake had begun his final patrol. Hours passed. The teams reported their progress with growing frustration. No hoofprints, no broken. branches at the right height for a mounted rider. No signs of shelter construction or emergency camps. It was as if Jake and Thunder had simply evaporated into the mountain air. By afternoon, the search had expanded. Additional rangers arrived from neighboring districts, along with a helicopter from the county sheriff's department. The aircraft's rotors thumped overhead, its powerful searchlight sweeping across the canopy even in broad daylight, looking for any flash of color that might indicate human presence. Tom's voice crackled through the radio from his position deep in the forest. His words carried a note of confusion that sent ice through Maria's veins. "Base, this is Team 2. We've found something unusual." The silence stretched for long seconds before Tom's voice returned, more uncertain now. "There's a clearing about 2 miles north of Jake's planned route. The vegetation is disturbed, but not by weather. Something else." Maria grabbed her radio. "Define disturbed, Tom." "Trees broken in a pattern, not wind damage. And the ground." He paused again. "The ground looks churned up, like something big happened here. But there's no tracks leading in or out." Sarah's team converged on Tom's location within an hour. What they found defied easy explanation. An area roughly 30 feet in diameter where the forest floor had been torn up, as if by some tremendous struggle. Young trees snapped off at chest height, undergrowth trampled flat. But the disturbed area ended abruptly at its edges with pristine forest beyond, showing no signs of whatever violence had occurred within the circle. Most unsettling of all, there were no tracks, no hoof prints, no boot prints, no evidence of how Jake and Thunder might have arrived at this place, or what had happened to them after, as the search teams gathered in the clearing, studying the scene with growing bewilderment. None of them noticed the small metallic object wedged deep in the bark of a damaged pine tree. It would remain hidden for 3 long years, until a completely different kind of search would bring new eyes to this forgotten piece of forest. What had happened in this clearing? And why did it feel like they were looking at a crime scene rather than an accident? 3 weeks into the search, the official operation had scaled down to a skeleton crew. The FBI had been called in on day 10, their forensic team combing through the mysterious clearing with scientific precision. Soil samples, bark scrapings, detailed photographs of every broken branch and disturbed rock. Their conclusions were as baffling as the scene itself. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez stood in the center of the clearing, her trained eyes scanning the damage pattern for the 100th time. 20 years of investigating everything from missing persons to organized crime had taught her to read violence, like a language. But this scene spoke in tongues she didn't recognize. The soil analysis had revealed traces of Jake's DNA on several broken branches. Blood, most likely from scrapes during whatever struggle had occurred here. But there were other traces too, organic compounds that the lab couldn't immediately identify, and the pattern of destruction suggested something far more complex than a simple accident or animal attack. Jake's wife, Linda Sullivan, arrived at the command post every morning at dawn. Her face had grown gaunt in the weeks since her husband's Havrisifi disappearance, her eyes carrying the particular weight of hope mixed with growing despair. She brought coffee for the search teams and fresh batteries for their equipment, her way of staying connected to the effort to bring Jake home. The media attention had been intense initially. Experienced ranger vanishes in Montana wilderness dominated local news cycles, with speculation ranging from bear attacks to equipment failure to voluntary disappearance. But as days turned to weeks without new developments, the cameras moved on to other stories, leaving behind only the dedicated core of searchers and the family that refused to give up. False leads arrived daily. Hikers reported seeing a riderless horse near Kalispell, A camping family claimed to have heard someone calling for help in the pre-dawn hours. Each report sent teams scrambling to investigate, only to return empty-handed. As evening fell, the most promising lead came from a hunting guide named Marcus Webb, who insisted he'd seen Jake and Thunder on a ridge trail 3 days after the disappearance. His description was detailed and convincing, down to Thunder's distinctive white blaze and Jake's worn leather jacket. A massive search of the area yielded nothing, but Webb's certainty planted seeds of doubt about the timeline everyone had constructed. By the 6th week, the official search was suspended. The decision came down from the district supervisor with the cold bureaucracy of limited budgets and resource allocation. They'd covered over 100 square miles, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and followed up on every credible lead. The forest had kept its secret. Maria Gonzalez stood alone in the clearing one final time before the command post was dismantled. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. Soon, snow would cover whatever evidence might remain, burying the mystery until spring thaw revealed the mountain's secrets once again. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A glint of metal high in the damaged pine tree, too high to reach without climbing equipment, and partially obscured by bark that had begun to heal over the wound. She made a mental note to have someone investigate when they returned in spring, then forgot about it in the chaos of packing up 3 weeks of search operations. Winter settled over Glacier National Park like a shroud, and the forest grew quiet once more. But deep in Sector 7, the clearing waited, patient, holding its secrets close, while the world above forgot about the ranger and his horse, who had vanished without explanation. What none of them realized was that Jake Sullivan's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was the first piece of a puzzle that would take years to complete, and the truth would prove more sinister than anyone could have imagined. October 2022. 3 years had passed since Jake Sullivan and Thunder vanished from Sector 7, and the Montana wilderness had reclaimed most evidence of the massive search operation. The command post site was marked only by faint tire tracks and a few forgotten tent stakes buried under layers of fallen leaves. Linda Sullivan had sold the house in Kalispell and moved to her sister's place in Colorado. The insurance settlement had been a long, brutal process, declaring someone legally dead when there's no body requires patience that grief doesn't allow. She'd stopped visiting the park after the 2nd year, when hope had finally been ground down by endless empty seasons. The ranger station had new faces now. Budget cuts had reduced staffing, and the old-timers like Tom Bradley had taken early retirement packages. Maria Gonzalez remained, but the spark in her eyes had dimmed. She carried the weight of unsolved mysteries poorly, and Jake's disappearance had carved a permanent worry line between her eyebrows. The forest itself seemed different now. Rangers reported an unusual quiet in Sector 7, as if wildlife had learned to avoid the area. Fewer deer tracks, fewer bird calls, even the usual population of black bears that frequented the region had shifted their territory southward. Some of the newer rangers joked about it being haunted, but the veterans didn't laugh. What no one knew was that Jake Sullivan's case file had been pulled 3 months earlier by a very different kind of investigator. Detective Ray Morrison of the Montana State Police had been tracking a pattern, a series of disappearances across the western United States that shared uncommon characteristics. Missing persons with extensive wilderness experience, remote locations with difficult access. Most significantly, evidence of struggle or violence at the scene, but no clear indication of what had caused it. Morrison worked from a small office in Helena, surrounded by maps dotted with red pins. Each pin marked a disappearance that fit his criteria. A hunting guide in Wyoming, a geologist in Idaho, a backcountry photographer in Utah, and now Jake Sullivan in Montana. 11 cases total over the past 5 years, scattered across 4 states, but connected by patterns that made Morrison's detective instincts itch. The official investigations had all reached the same conclusions: wilderness accidents, animal attacks, equipment failures leading to falls or exposure, natural explanations for unnatural events. But Morrison saw something else in the case files, a consistency of details that suggested human involvement rather than nature's random cruelty. Each disappearance occurred in areas with limited cell phone coverage and minimal foot traffic. Each victim was experienced in wilderness survival, reducing the likelihood of accidental death. Most troubling of all, each case included evidence of disturbance or violence that couldn't be adequately explained by wildlife encounters or environmental factors. Morrison had been a detective for 15 years, specializing in cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. He'd learned to trust patterns over coincidences, and the pattern emerging from these disappearances suggested something organized, something planned, something that used the wilderness as both hunting ground and burial site. His interest in Jake Sullivan's case had been triggered by a detail that appeared in none of the official reports, a detail discovered by accident when Morrison interviewed Tom Bradley during his retirement party at a Helena bar. 3 beers into the evening, the former ranger had mentioned the glint of metal in the damaged pine tree, the observation that Maria Gonzalez had never followed up on. The next morning, Morrison loaded his vehicle with climbing equipment and made the drive to Glacier National Park. If there was evidence waiting in that tree, it had been undisturbed for 3 years. Evidence had a way of telling stories, even when witnesses had long since stopped talking. But as his truck wound through the mountain roads toward Sector 7, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving toward something much larger than a single missing person case. The pattern he'd been tracking suggested a network, an organization with resources and planning capability that extended far beyond random wilderness encounters. What was hidden in that Montana forest? And was Jake Sullivan's disappearance really the beginning? Or just the first time someone had noticed the predator stalking America's most remote places? Detective Ray Morrison's climbing equipment felt foreign in his hands as he approached the towering pine tree. 15 years of police work had kept him in decent shape, but scrambling up 30 feet of rough bark was outside his usual skill set. The October morning was crisp, with frost still clinging to the shadows where sunlight couldn't reach. The clearing looked different than the crime scene photos had suggested. Nature had begun reclaiming the disturbed area, with new growth pushing through the churned soil and moss covering the broken stumps. But the pattern of damage remained clearly visible, too organized to be accidental, too violent to ignore. Morrison secured his climbing harness and began the ascent. The bark was rough against his palms, providing good grip despite the morning moisture. As he climbed higher, the metal object that had caught Maria's eye 3 years earlier became more distinct. What he found embedded in the wood made him forget the burning sensation in his forearms. It was a horseshoe. Not just any horseshoe, but one with distinctive custom markings stamped into the steel. The initials, JS, were clearly visible despite 3 years of weather exposure. Jake Sullivan's initials, Thunder's shoe. But the location of the horseshoe raised questions that made Morrison's detective instincts scream warnings. The shoe was embedded, nearly 25 feet above ground level, driven into the tree trunk with such force that the steel had bent around the impact point. Whatever had torn the shoe from Thunder's hoof and launched it to this height possessed strength that defied explanation. Morrison carefully extracted the horseshoe using tools from his evidence kit. The metal was clean of any organic material that might have provided DNA evidence, but the force required to embed it so deeply into living wood suggested an impact velocity that made his stomach turn. No natural forest accident could generate this kind of kinetic energy. He photographed the tree from every angle before beginning his descent. The horseshoe felt heavier in his evidence bag than its actual weight suggested, as if it carried the accumulated mystery of 3 years. As his boots touched solid ground, Morrison found himself looking at the clearing with new eyes. The disturbed area suddenly made more sense. The pattern of broken trees and churned earth formed rough circle with the embedded horseshoe at its center, as if something had exploded outward from this point, scattering debris and violence in all directions before vanishing without a trace. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from his partner back in Helena. Another disappearance had been reported in Colorado. A backcountry ski guide who'd failed to return from a routine trail assessment. Early reports mentioned evidence of struggle at an abandoned campsite, but no clear indication of what had happened to the missing man. Standing in the Montana clearing with Jake Sullivan's horseshoe in his evidence bag, Morrison felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to take shape. Not random wilderness accidents or animal attacks, but something organized and methodical. Something that used America's most remote areas as a hunting ground, selecting victims with specific skills and experience levels. But what kind of organization had the resources and capability to make experienced outdoorsmen disappear without leaving conventional evidence? And what did they want with people like Jake Sullivan? Morrison made detailed measurements of the clearing, noting the precise location where he'd found the horseshoe and photographing every broken tree and disturbed patch of ground. Whatever had happened here 3 years ago, it was the key to understanding a pattern of disappearances that stretched across multiple states. As he packed his equipment and prepared to leave Sector 7, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest around the clearing felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the wildlife understood that this place held secrets too dangerous to disturb. The horseshoe in his evidence bag would prove to be more than just a clue. It would be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and revealed a truth that some people were willing to kill to protect. But for now, Morrison had only questions. Questions about the impossible physics of a horseshoe embedded 25 feet up a tree. Questions about why experienced outdoor professionals kept vanishing from remote locations. And most troubling of all, questions about whether Jake Sullivan and Thunder were victims of something far worse than anyone had imagined. Back in his Helena office, Detective Morrison spread the case files across every available surface. 11 disappearances now, with Jake Sullivan's horseshoe providing the first piece of physical evidence that suggested something beyond natural explanations. The metal sat in a clear evidence bag on his desk, its bent shape serving as a constant reminder of forces he didn't yet understand. Morrison had called in favors from contacts across 4 state police departments, requesting copies of every case file related to wilderness disappearances in the past decade. What emerged was a pattern so subtle that no single investigation had detected it, but viewed together, the cases painted a disturbing picture. The victims shared more than wilderness experience. They were all men between the ages of 35 and 50. All had military or law enforcement backgrounds or extensive survival training. All had disappeared from areas with limited access roads and minimal surveillance coverage. Most importantly, all had vanished during specific weather windows, typically when storm systems provided natural cover for whatever operations were occurring in these remote locations. Sarah Chen, the tracker from Jake's search team, had taken a job with the state police after the budget cuts at the national park. Morrison called her in to review the accumulated evidence, hoping her expertise might reveal connections he was missing. She studied the crime scene photographs with intense focus, her finger tracing patterns across the images. "These aren't random," she said finally. "Look at the spacing of the damage, the way the trees are broken. This follows a methodology." Morrison leaned back in his chair. Methodology? Like someone was testing weapons or equipment. The patterns are too consistent across different locations to be natural phenomena. She pulled out a map and began marking locations with colored pins. "And look at this. They're all within 50 miles of military installations or research facilities." The revelation hit Morrison like cold water. He'd been thinking about the disappearances as random predatory behavior, but Sarah's observation suggested something far more organized, something connected to institutions with resources and technology that could explain the impossible physics of Jake's horseshoe. Morrison's computer chimed with an incoming email from his contact at the FBI. Agent Martinez, who had worked the original Sullivan investigation, had sent him something that made his blood run cold. Satellite imagery from the dates of 3 different disappearances, all showing unusual aircraft activity in the vicinity of the vanishing points. The aircraft weren't standard helicopters or planes. They appeared as dark objects moving at speeds and altitudes that didn't match civilian or standard military flight patterns. Most troubling, they showed up on satellite imagery, but had no corresponding flight plans filed with the FAA. Morrison reached for his secure phone and dialed a number he'd hoped never to use again. Colonel James Harrison had been his commanding officer during his brief military police stint 20 years earlier. Harrison now worked in a Pentagon office with no public designation, handling cases that fell between the cracks of normal military jurisdiction. "Ray Morrison." Harrison's voice carried the same authoritative tone Morrison remembered. "I wondered when you'd call about this." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison felt his detective instincts shift into high gear. "You know why I'm calling? I know about your little investigation into wilderness disappearances, and I know you found Jake Sullivan's horseshoe in that tree." Harrison's tone remained professionally neutral, but Morrison detected an undercurrent of warning. "Some cases are better left closed, Detective." Morrison looked at the evidence spread across his office: photographs, case files, the horseshoe sitting in its evidence bag. People have a right to know what happened to their families. Do they? Harrison's question carried implications that made Morrison's skin crawl. What if the truth would cause more harm than the mystery? What if some secrets exist to protect national security interests that exceed individual tragedy? The line went dead, leaving Morrison staring at his phone and feeling like he'd just stepped into something much larger and more dangerous than a series of missing person cases. Harrison's knowledge of details that weren't in any public reports meant government involvement at levels Morrison hadn't imagined. But the horseshoe on his desk represented more than evidence. It represented Jake Sullivan, Thunder, and 11 other people who had families still waiting for answers. Whatever Colonel Harrison and his mysterious Pentagon office were protecting, it had cost real lives and destroyed real families. Morrison opened a new file folder and wrote "Project Classification Unknown" across the tab. If this case involved national security issues, he would need to approach it differently, more carefully, but he wouldn't abandon it. The truth about what happened to Jake Sullivan was buried somewhere in the intersection of wilderness disappearances and classified government operations, and Detective Ray Morrison was going to dig until he found it, regardless of who wanted it to stay buried. But what he couldn't know was that his phone call to Harrison had triggered alert protocols in offices where his investigation was already being monitored. The clock was now ticking on his ability to uncover the truth before those who wanted it buried took more permanent action. Detective Morrison's house sat on a quiet street in Helena, surrounded by the kind of suburban normalcy that made it easy to forget about missing rangers and embedded horseshoes. But at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, normalcy shattered like glass. When Morrison's bedroom window exploded inward, he rolled out of bed instinctively, years of police training overriding the confusion of sudden awakening. Glass fragments glittered across his hardwood floor, reflecting the streetlight that filtered through his now ruined window. But it wasn't random vandalism that had sent his heart racing. It was the small cylindrical object that had accompanied the breaking glass. Morrison approached, carefully, his service weapon drawn despite being in his own bedroom. The object looked like a military smoke grenade, but it wasn't releasing any visible vapor. Instead, a small red LED light blinked steadily on its surface, accompanied by a soft electronic beeping that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. You have 30 seconds before the device activates." Morrison's laptop was already open on his kitchen table. His investigation files spread around it like evidence of an obsession. The new email had no subject line and came from an encrypted address that would disappear within minutes of being read. The message was brief. "Your investigation ends now, Detective Morrison." Jake Sullivan and the others made contact with classified defense projects. Their disappearances are matters of national security that exceed your clearance level. Close the files, destroy the evidence, and forget what you think you know. This is your only warning. The email included a series of photographs that made Morrison's blood run cold. Images of his house taken from multiple angles over several days. Pictures of his car in the police station parking lot. Screenshots of his computer screen showing the case files he'd been compiling. They'd been watching him far longer than he'd realized. But the final photograph was the most chilling. Sarah Chen leaving a coffee shop downtown, apparently unaware that she was being surveilled. The message was clear. His investigation had put others at risk. Morrison's laptop screen flickered, then went black. The device in his bedroom stopped, beeping. When he checked, the object was gone, as if it had never existed. Only the broken window remained as evidence of the night's intrusion. And even that could be explained as random vandalism if necessary. The detective sat in his dark kitchen, surrounded by case files that suddenly felt like toxic waste rather than evidence. Someone with serious resources and capabilities wanted his investigation stopped, and they'd demonstrated the ability to enter his home undetected while making it clear that Sarah Chen's safety depended on his compliance. But compliance meant abandoning Jake Sullivan, Thunder, and 11 other missing people to whatever fate had befallen them in America's wilderness. It meant telling families like Linda Sullivan that their questions would never be answered because those answers threatened unnamed national security interests. Morrison reached for his phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Sarah, pack a bag and get out of your apartment. Now, don't ask questions, just go somewhere safe and call me when you're secure." She didn't hesitate. "How long do I have?" "You're probably already being watched. Move fast, stay in public areas, and assume your phone is compromised after this call." Morrison destroyed his phone after hanging up, removing the battery and dropping the components into different trash containers around his neighborhood. By dawn, he'd relocated his investigation files to a storage unit across town and established new protocols for communication and research. Whoever had broken into his house had made a critical mistake. They'd shown their hand too early, revealing capabilities and resources that confirmed Morrison's suspicions about government involvement. More importantly, they'd threatened someone under his protection, which transformed a professional investigation into a personal mission. The warning had been clear, but Morrison had received plenty of warnings during his police career. Some cases were worth the risk, and some truths were worth the danger required to expose them. Jake Sullivan and his horseshoe embedded in that. Montana Pine represented more than just another missing person case. They represented a conspiracy that needed to be exposed regardless of who wanted it buried. But Morrison now understood that his investigation had evolved beyond simple detective work. He was up against opponents with military-grade surveillance capabilities and the resources to make people disappear permanently. If he was going to continue, he would need allies, resources, and a level of operational security that went far beyond normal police procedures. The game had changed, but Morrison wasn't ready to quit playing. Not when the stakes included real families waiting for answers and a pattern of disappearances that suggested ongoing operations in America's wilderness. What he didn't realize was that his decision to continue would put him on a collision course with forces that had been operating in the shadows for decades, protecting secrets that some people considered more valuable than human lives. 3 days after the break-in, Morrison met Dr. Elena Vasquez in a diner outside Billings, chosen specifically for its location at the intersection of 3 major highways, multiple escape routes if the meeting went wrong. Vasquez had been a materials physicist at Los Alamos before becoming a whistleblower, and her expertise in classified weapons research made her one of the few people who might understand the impossible physics of Jake's horseshoe. She studied the evidence photographs with scientific precision, occasionally making notes in a code Morrison didn't recognize. The horseshoe's embedded position and the force required to achieve that placement seemed to fascinate her more than disturb her. "I've seen similar damage patterns," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "From weapons testing in New Mexico. Directed energy systems that could generate kinetic impacts without conventional explosives." Morrison felt pieces clicking into place. Energy weapons? Theoretical until recently. The military has been developing systems that can project focused electromagnetic pulses or sonic waves with enough intensity to cause physical damage at distance. Vasquez traced the damage pattern in one of the clearing photographs. "Your clearing looks like a testing ground." The implications were staggering. If Jake Sullivan had stumbled into a classified weapons test, his disappearance wasn't random. It was containment, permanent containment to protect classified research that couldn't afford witnesses. Vasquez continued, her scientific detachment making the horror more real. "The pattern suggests multiple weapon systems tested simultaneously. Different energy, signatures, different focal points. Your missing ranger and his horse weren't victims of an accident. They were collateral damage in a field test." Morrison's phone buzzed with a secure message from Sarah Chen, who had gone underground using protocols they'd established for compromised investigations. She'd found something in the financial records of the missing persons. All 11 had received unusual payments in the months before their disappearances. Payments from shell companies that traced back to defense contractors. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. The missing persons weren't random victims. They were participants, recruited for something they thought was legitimate, then eliminated when their usefulness ended or when they learned too much about what they'd been involved in. Vasquez was reading the financial data over Morrison's shoulder. "Mercenary contracts," she identified immediately. "These payment structures match what private military contractors use for off-books operations. Your missing persons were hired for something classified, then disappeared to maintain operational security." Morrison thought about Jake Sullivan's military background, his survival skills, his access to remote areas through his ranger position. The perfect recruit for operations that required wilderness expertise and minimal oversight. But what kind of operations required that level of secrecy and were worth killing to protect? "There's something else," Vasquez said, pulling out a tablet loaded with satellite imagery. I've been tracking unusual electromagnetic signatures across the western United States, patterns that suggest large-scale energy weapon testing in remote locations. Your disappearance sites correspond exactly with the strongest signature locations. The satellite data painted a picture of coordinated operations spanning multiple states over several years. Not isolated incidents, but a systematic program using America's wilderness as a testing ground for weapons technology that officially didn't exist. Morrison studied the patterns, feeling like he was looking at evidence of a shadow war being conducted on American soil. Who has the authority to authorize something like this? Nobody in the normal chain of command, Vasquez replied grimly. This level of classification and resource allocation suggests programs that exist outside standard oversight. Black budget operations answerable only to a very small group of people with extraordinary security clearances. Sarah's latest message contained coordinates for a location in Wyoming where she'd discovered evidence of recent activity. Tire tracks from heavy vehicles, temporary structures that had been dismantled and removed, and, most significantly, electromagnetic readings that matched the signature patterns Vasquez had identified. Morrison felt the investigation shifting from historical analysis to active pursuit. Whatever operations had killed Jake Sullivan and the others weren't finished. They were ongoing, using America's most remote locations as testing grounds for weapons that could reshape modern warfare. But as they prepared to leave the diner, Vasquez grabbed Morrison's arm with sudden urgency. "Detective, if I'm right about what you've stumbled into, then continuing this investigation will make you a target for termination. These aren't people who issue warnings twice." Morrison looked at the evidence, spread across their table. Photographs, financial records, satellite imagery that told the story of American citizens murdered to protect classified weapons research. Jake Sullivan's bent horseshoe had led him to something far larger and more dangerous than a simple missing person case. The question now wasn't whether to continue the investigation, but whether they could survive long enough to expose the truth. Because somewhere in the shadows of black budget operations and classified research programs, people were making decisions about who lived and who disappeared to protect secrets that officially didn't exist. And Detective Ray Morrison had just become their next problem to solve. The Wyoming location sat in a valley so remote it didn't appear on most civilian maps. Morrison and Sarah approached on foot, having abandoned their vehicle 5 miles away, at an abandoned mining road. The electromagnetic readings Vasquez had detected were stronger here, causing Morrison's compass to spin wildly and creating a subtle interference pattern on their radio equipment. Sarah moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years tracking through wilderness. Her equipment detected recent human activity, tire impressions in protected soil, disturbed vegetation patterns that indicated heavy machinery, and, most telling, chemical residues in the ground that suggested exotic fuel sources. The test site revealed itself gradually as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley. What had once been pristine wilderness now bore the scars of intensive industrial activity. Circular patterns burned into the earth, metal debris scattered in geometric arrangements, and most unsettling areas where the very soil appeared to have been fused into glass-like substances by extreme heat. Morrison photographed everything, with a camera modified to resist electromagnetic interference. The damage patterns were larger and more sophisticated than what they'd found at Jake's site in Montana, suggesting technological advancement or escalation in whatever program was responsible. Sarah's electromagnetic detector went wild near the center of the largest burn pattern. Buried beneath a thin layer of scattered earth, they found fragments of military-grade equipment bearing serial numbers that shouldn't exist according to official defense procurement records. But it was the personal effects that made Morrison's investigation personal again. a wallet containing the ID of Marcus Webb, the hunting guide who had claimed to see Jake Sullivan 3 days after his disappearance. Webb's name appeared on Morrison's list of missing persons, but he'd vanished 6 months after Jake, from a location nearly 200 miles away. The wallet contained more than identification. Tucked behind Webb's driver's license was a folded piece of paper with coordinates, dates, and a brief message. If something happens to me, this is where it started. The tests aren't what they told us. People are dying. Morrison felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Webb hadn't seen Jake after his disappearance. He'd been part of the same program, recruited for operations he'd eventually realized were more sinister than advertised. His sighting of Jake had been a desperate attempt to draw attention to locations where classified testing was occurring. Sarah's voice cut through Morrison's thoughts with urgency. "We need to leave. Now." The sound of helicopters approached from the east, still distant but closing fast. Morrison grabbed the evidence they'd collected, while Sarah erased their tracks using techniques that spoke to training beyond standard Park Service procedures. They reached their vehicle as the first helicopter appeared over the ridge, its searchlight sweeping the valley they'd just evacuated. Morrison's modified radio crackled with military communications, search patterns, grid coordinates, and, most chilling, orders to secure any civilian personnel for debriefing. The drive back to Helena took 8 hours through back roads and Forest Service routes designed to avoid main highways and potential surveillance checkpoints. Morrison's evidence bag now contained fragments that proved classified weapons testing was occurring on American soil, using recruited civilians who were subsequently eliminated to maintain operational security. But Webb's final message suggested something even more disturbing. The phrase, "people are dying," implied the program wasn't just eliminating witnesses, it was actively causing casualties during testing phases. Jake Sullivan and Thunder hadn't just stumbled into a test site. They'd become test subjects themselves. Back in his secure location, Morrison spread the Wyoming evidence across his table alongside Jake's Horseshoe and the accumulated files from 11 disappearances. The pattern was complete now, telling a story of systematic murder disguised as wilderness accidents. Dr. Vasquez arrived after dark, having monitored government communications channels for any mention of Morrison's investigation. Her news was grim. Significant resources were being allocated to contain the security breach represented by Morrison's discoveries. "They know what you found in Wyoming," she said without preamble. "Multiple agencies have been activated, and your name is on classification lists I haven't seen since my Los Alamos days." Morrison studied the evidence one final time. Jake Sullivan's Horseshoe, bent by forces that shouldn't exist, embedded in a tree by weapons that officially weren't, real as part of a program that was systematically murdering American citizens to protect classified research. The investigation had reached its critical decision point. Morrison could disappear into witness protection, abandoning the evidence and leaving families like Linda Sullivan without answers. Or he could take the evidence public, knowing that doing so would make him a target for the same forces that had eliminated Jake and the others. But as he looked at Webb's final message and Jake's twisted horseshoe, Morrison realized the decision had already been made. Some truths were worth dying for, and some conspiracies were too dangerous to remain hidden. The question now wasn't whether to expose the program, but how to do it in a way that would protect the evidence long enough for the world to see what was being done in America's wilderness. What Morrison couldn't know was that his investigation had already triggered protocols designed to eliminate security breaches permanently. The forces that had made Jake Sullivan disappear were now focused on making Detective Ray Morrison join him. Dr. Vasquez's encrypted files painted a picture of horror that extended far beyond individual disappearances. Project Wilderness, as the classified program was designated, had been operational for 7 years under the oversight of a joint Pentagon-CIA task force with unprecedented authority and unlimited black budget funding. Morrison studied the organizational charts on Vasquez's tablet, recognizing names from news headlines and congressional hearings. Defense contractors, intelligence officials, and military leaders who publicly advocated for ethics in warfare while privately authorizing weapons tests on unwitting American citizens. The program's methodology was brutally efficient. Potential subjects were identified through psychological profiles and background checks. Military veterans with wilderness skills, outdoor professionals with access to remote areas, and individuals whose disappearance could be explained as natural accidents. They were recruited through legitimate-seeming contracts, then transported to testing sites where they became human subjects for weapons systems that violated every international treaty on warfare. Sarah Chen's investigation had uncovered the financial pipeline. Shell companies funneled money from defense budgets to private contractors who established fake outdoor recreation businesses and wilderness consulting firms. The missing persons had all been employed by these front organizations, believing they were conducting environmental assessments or security evaluations for government agencies. Jake Sullivan's case file revealed the specific circumstances of his recruitment. His ranger position provided perfect cover for conducting special surveys in remote areas, and his military background made him an ideal subject for testing survival capabilities under extreme conditions. The October 15th patrol had been his final assignment, a weapons test disguised as routine Forest Service duties. What had gone wrong at the Montana test site became clear through Vasquez's technical analysis. The electromagnetic pulse weapon being tested had malfunctioned, creating an energy cascade that destroyed the containment protocols. Jake and Thunder had been caught in an uncontrolled energy release that should have killed them instantly. Instead, something had gone catastrophically wrong with the technology itself. The horseshoe embedded in the pine tree wasn't just evidence of Jake's death. It was evidence of a weapons malfunction that had created effects the researchers hadn't anticipated. The energy release had been powerful enough to launch a steely horseshoe 25 feet into the air with enough force to embed it in living wood, but not controlled enough to prevent collateral damage to the surrounding forest. Morrison's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown source. The text contained coordinates and a time. Final evidence. Come alone. Trust no one in official channels. Against Sarah's protests, Morrison drove to the coordinates. Arrest. Stop on Interstate 90, where a figure in a federal agent's jacket waited beside an unmarked sedan. The man looked familiar, and Morrison realized he'd seen him in surveillance photos from Jake's original investigation. Special Agent Martinez. The man identified himself, though Morrison remembered the name from the FBI reports. I was part of the original Sullivan investigation, and I've been watching your work ever since. Martinez opened his trunk, revealing boxes of classified documents that made Morrison's evidence collection look minimal by comparison. Case files, financial records, technical specifications, and most damaging of all, video footage from the test sites showing the actual moment of weapons deployment against human subjects. Project Wilderness has been my obsession for 3 years, Martinez explained. I've been collecting evidence while maintaining my cover within the investigating agencies, but they're getting close to identifying me as the leak, and I need someone outside the federal system to take this public. The video footage was worse than Morrison had imagined. Test subjects believing they were conducting routine exercises, while weapon systems targeted them from concealed positions. Electromagnetic, pulse devices that caused instant cardiac arrest, sonic weapons that liquefied internal organs, energy beams that flash vaporized human tissue while leaving equipment intact. Jake Sullivan's test had been different. The footage showed him and Thunder entering the clearing, then a blinding flash that overloaded the recording equipment. When the image cleared, both man and horse had vanished, leaving only the circular pattern of destruction that had puzzled investigators for 3 years. The energy cascade scattered their molecular structure, Martinez explained with clinical detachment. They weren't killed conventionally. They were atomically dispersed across several cubic miles of forest. The horseshoe was the only piece, dense enough to maintain cohesion and embed in the tree. Morrison felt sick as the full implications became clear. Jake Sullivan and Thunder hadn't just been murdered. They'd been literally disintegrated by weapons technology that turned human beings into scattered atoms. The families waiting for bodies to bury would never have that closure because there were no bodies left to find. Martinez continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much classified horror. 43 people have been killed in Project Wilderness tests over 7 years. Their disappearances have been covered up as wilderness accidents, animal attacks, and equipment failures. But the program is expanding, and the body count is accelerating. The evidence boxes contained proof of an industrial-scale murder program operating under the cover of national security. Families destroyed, lives ended, and American wilderness turned into testing grounds for weapons that violated every principle of human rights and constitutional protection. Morrison realized he was looking at evidence that could topple governments and expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American defense and intelligence agencies. But he was also looking at his own death warrant. Knowledge. This dangerous wasn't allowed to exist outside official channels. As if reading his thoughts, Martinez handed Morrison a final folder. "Dead man's switch," he explained. "If anything happens to either of us, this evidence gets released automatically to every major news organization simultaneously. It's the only reason we're both still alive." The conspiracy was fully exposed now, mapped in technical detail and documented with evidence that couldn't be discredited or dismissed. But exposure was only the first step. Survival would require getting the truth to the public before Project Wilderness eliminated the witnesses who could testify to its existence. What they couldn't know was that their meeting had been monitored. Their dead man's switch had been compromised, and termination protocols were already being implemented to protect the program that had turned America's wilderness into a graveyard. Morrison's secure location burned at 3:17 a.m., taking with it 3 years of investigation files and nearly destroying the evidence that could expose Project Wilderness. Only his paranoid decision to maintain multiple backup locations saved the documentation from complete destruction. But the message was clear. His investigation had been fully compromised. Sarah Chen's emergency signal reached Morrison as he watched firefighters battle the blaze that had once been his safe house. Her coded message was brief but terrifying. "Martinez dead. Car accident. Not accident. They're cleaning house." The dead man's switch that was supposed to protect them had been neutralized within hours of their meeting. Martinez's automated systems had been hacked and disabled before a truck ran him off a mountain highway, making his death look like another tragic accident in Montana's dangerous terrain. Morrison gathered the surviving evidence: Jake's horseshoe, the Wyoming fragments, and the classified documents Martinez had provided, and began a desperate race across state lines. Every hour he remained in one location increased the risk of termination, but he needed time to verify the evidence and establish secure channels for publication. Dr. Vasquez had gone underground, using protocols from her Los Alamos days, but her final message contained coordinates for a backup facility where the electromagnetic signatures from Project Wilderness were being monitored in real time. The facility was operated by a group of former military scientists who had become whistleblowers. When they discovered the true nature of their research, The underground facility was hidden beneath a defunct mining operation in Colorado, its existence known only to researchers who had worked on classified energy weapons programs. Morrison arrived to find a sophisticated monitoring operation that had been tracking Project Wilderness activities across multiple states for over 2 years. Dr. Michael Chen, Sarah's brother and a former weapons physicist, showed Morrison data that made the scope of the conspiracy even more horrifying. Real-time electromagnetic monitoring had detected 47 separate weapons tests in the past year alone, with casualty estimates exceeding 100 victims. They're not just testing individual weapons anymore, Chen explained, his monitors displaying energy signatures from across the western United States. They're conducting coordinated field exercises with multiple systems simultaneously. The program has evolved from research and development into operational deployment. The IDOIP monitoring equipment had recorded Jake Sullivan's final moments with scientific precision. The energy cascade that had atomized him and Thunder had registered as a magnitude 7 electromagnetic pulse, equivalent to a small nuclear detonation concentrated into a few square meters of forest. The weapons malfunction that had scattered their molecular structure across the Montana wilderness was documented in data files that proved the program's lethal capabilities beyond any doubt. But Chen's most disturbing revelation was the program's expansion timeline. Project Wilderness was transitioning from isolated testing to full-scale operations, with deployment scheduled for international conflicts where energy weapons could be used against enemy forces without violating nuclear treaties. Jake Sullivan and the others weren't just test subjects, Chen continued. They were beta tests for weapons systems that are about to be deployed globally. Their murders were research and development for technologies that will be used in future wars. Morrison realized that exposing Project Wilderness wasn't just about justice for the victims. It was about preventing energy weapons technology from being unleashed on battlefields around the world. The evidence in his possession could stop a new category of warfare before it began. Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the facility's secure communications system. She'd infiltrated a Project Wilderness site in Nevada and discovered preparation for a massive field test involving multiple energy weapons systems and over 30 recruited subjects. The operation was scheduled for the next morning, and if successful, would represent the program's transition from testing to full operational status. Morrison faced an impossible choice. He could take the evidence public immediately, exposing the conspiracy but potentially failing to prevent the Nevada operation. Or he could attempt to stop the field test directly, risking everything on a mission that would require confronting the most classified military operation in American history. Looking at Jake Sullivan's Horseshoe and thinking about the 30 people who would die in Nevada if he chose the safe path, Morrison made his decision. Some investigations required more than documentation. They required direct intervention, regardless of the personal cost. The clock was ticking toward the IDOI largest Project Wilderness operation ever attempted, and Morrison was the only person in position to stop it. But challenging a classified military program with unlimited resources and official authorization would require more than evidence. It would require a willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. As he prepared for what might be his final mission, Morrison couldn't shake the image of Jake Sullivan's morning patrol, a routine assignment that had ended with molecular disintegration in a Montana forest. Tomorrow, 30 more people would face the same fate unless someone was willing to stand between them and the weapons that officially didn't exist. The race against time had begun, and the stakes included not just the current victims, but the future of warfare itself. The Nevada test site sprawled across 50 square miles of desert, hidden within a military reservation that officially didn't exist on any public maps. Morrison approached from the east at dawn, using night vision equipment to navigate through a landscape that had been transformed into a high-tech killing field. Sarah Chen's intelligence had been precise. 30 recruited subjects were positioned across the test area, believing they were participating in a survival exercise for a legitimate defense contractor. Electromagnetic weapon systems were concealed. In camouflaged bunkers, their targeting systems locked onto individuals who had no idea they were about to become casualties in the most classified military program in American history. Morrison's modified radio intercepted the countdown communications between test control and the weapons platforms. 15 minutes until the first energy pulse deployment. 14 minutes until Jake Sullivan's fate would be replicated 30 times over in the Nevada desert. The evidence Morrison had gathered over months of investigation was now stored in dead man's switches operated by Dr. Chen's underground facility. If Morrison failed to check in every hour, the documentation would be released simultaneously to every major news organization globally. But that wouldn't save the 30 people currently positioned as unwitting targets in the desert below. Morrison's Horseshoe insertion point was a rocky outcropping that provided cover while offering sight lines to the primary weapons emplacement. The electromagnetic pulse system that had killed Jake and Thunder was identical to the installation he could see through his tactical scope, a cylindrical device that looked more like a radio antenna than the most lethal weapon ever deployed. On American soil, the subjects were spread across the test area in a pattern that would allow multiple weapon systems to engage simultaneously. Morrison recognized the tactical deployment from the classified footage Agent Martinez had shown. Arrangements designed to test various energy weapons against human targets under controlled conditions. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece from her position on the opposite ridge. Control team has visual on all subjects. Weapon systems are charging for initial deployment. You have maybe 10 minutes before they're committed to the test. Sequence. Morrison made his decision with the same calculated desperation that had driven his entire investigation. If he couldn't stop the weapons systems directly, he could disrupt the test by exposing the subjects to what they were really facing. His emergency flare gun sent a brilliant red signal into the dawn sky, visible across the entire test area. The subjects, men with military and outdoor experience who had been recruited for what they believed was legitimate work, recognized the universal distress signal and began converging on his position. The test control center erupted in confused communications as their carefully orchestrated exercise dissolved into chaos. Subjects abandoning their assigned positions, moving away from the targeting zones, clustering together in ways that made precision engagement impossible. Morrison's amplified voice carried across the desert through a military-grade megaphone. You're not in a training exercise. You're targets for classified weapons testing. The energy systems around you are designed to kill, not train. Get to the rocky areas and take cover now. The reaction was immediate. 30 experienced outdoorsmen recognizing a life-threatening situation and responding with the survival instincts that had made them attractive recruits for Project Wilderness. They scattered toward defensible positions, moving away from the open areas where weapons systems had calculated optimal targeting solutions. But Morrison's intervention had also triggered security protocols designed to protect the classified. Operation at any cost. Military vehicles emerged from concealed positions, their occupants equipped with live ammunition and authorization to eliminate any threat to operational security. Sarah's warning came through his earpiece with desperate urgency. Multiple armed teams converging on your position. They're not trying to arrest you. They're trying to eliminate witnesses. Morrison realized that stopping the test had only delayed the inevitable. Project Wilderness operated under classification levels that made individual lives expendable when measured against program security. The 30 subjects he'd saved from energy weapons were now targets for conventional Elimination to protect the conspiracy. The firefight that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison and Sarah, positioned on high ground with military-grade equipment, engaged security teams that had superior numbers but inferior tactical positions. The recruited subjects, recognizing that their survival depended on resistance rather than compliance, provided covering fire with whatever equipment they'd brought for their supposed training exercise. In the chaos of combat, Dr. Chen's automated systems detected the absence of Morrison's hourly check-in and began releasing the accumulated evidence to news organizations worldwide. By the time the shooting stopped, Project Wilderness documents were already being transmitted to investigative reporters across 6 countries. The final moment came when Morrison found himself face-to-face with Colonel Harrison, the Pentagon official who had tried to warn him away from the investigation months earlier. Harrison's weapon was drawn, but his expression carried resignation rather than determination. "You've destroyed something that took decades to build," Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that exposure meant the end of his career and possibly his life. Morrison kept his own weapon trained on Harrison while speaking into his radio for the final evidence transmission. Jake Sullivan was a good man who died protecting American wilderness. The 43 people murdered by your program were patriots who deserved better than being used as test subjects for illegal weapons. Harrison's response was barely audible. National security requires sacrifices that civilians can't understand. National security doesn't require murdering American citizens, Morrison replied, and some secrets are too dangerous to keep. The standoff ended when Harrison lowered his weapon, recognizing that the evidence release had made further violence pointless. Project Wilderness was exposed, its leadership identified, and its operations documented in detail that would withstand any classification challenge. As federal investigators arrived to secure the site, Morrison looked across the Nevada desert, where 30 people were alive because someone had finally connected Jake Sullivan's Horseshoe to a conspiracy that stretched across multiple states and government agencies. The investigation that had started with a missing ranger in Montana had ended with the exposure of the most classified military program in American history. But the cost had been measured in lives destroyed and families shattered by secrets that some people had been willing to kill to protect. Jake Sullivan and Thunder were still gone, their atoms scattered across a Montana forest by weapons that officially didn't exist. But their deaths had finally been given meaning through the exposure of a program that had turned America's wilderness into a testing ground for technologies that violated every principle of human dignity and constitutional protection. 6 months later, the congressional hearings dominated every news cycle as America grappled with revelations that challenged the very foundations of government accountability. Project Wilderness had been fully exposed, its classified documents declassified, under court order, and its leadership facing criminal charges that would reshape how the nation approached military research ethics. Detective Ray Morrison sat in the witness chair, Jake Sullivan's Horseshoe placed on the table before him as evidence in proceedings that had captivated the world. The bent piece of steel had become a symbol, representing not just one ranger's death, but the 43 American citizens who had been murdered to advance weapons technology that violated international law. Linda Sullivan attended every day of the hearings, her presence a constant reminder of the human cost of classified programs that operated beyond normal oversight. She had finally received answers about her husband's disappearance, though the truth, molecular disintegration by experimental energy weapons, provided closure that came with its own form of horror. Senator Patricia Williams, chairing the Intelligence Oversight Committee, addressed Morrison directly during his final day of testimony. "Detective, in your investigation of Ranger Sullivan's disappearance, what would you say was the most significant factor in exposing this conspiracy?" Morrison looked at the horseshoe, remembering the moment 3 years earlier when he'd found it embedded impossibly high in a Montana pine tree. "One piece of evidence that didn't make sense," he answered. "Sometimes the truth hides in details that seem impossible until you understand the technology that created them." The legal aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Colonel Harrison and 14 other military and intelligence officials faced federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and violations of constitutional protections. The defense contractors who had operated the front companies were prosecuted under RICO statutes typically reserved for organized crime. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony about the weapons technology involved in the murders. Her technical explanations of electromagnetic pulse systems and directed energy weapons provided the scientific foundation that transformed abstract classifications into concrete evidence of systematic killing. The families of all 43 victims filed a class action lawsuit that resulted in the largest government settlement in American history. More importantly, the case established legal precedent preventing future classified programs from operating without specific congressional oversight and judicial review. Sarah Chen received the FBI's highest civilian honor for her role in exposing Project Wilderness, though she declined the public ceremony. Her brother Michael's monitoring facility was incorporated into a new federal oversight program designed to detect unauthorized weapons testing in American wilderness areas. The Nevada test site had been converted into a memorial park where visitors could learn about the dangers of unaccountable military research. Plaques bearing the names of all 43 victims served as permanent reminders that national security required transparency rather than secrecy to maintain democratic principles. But for Morrison, the most meaningful recognition came during a quiet ceremony at Glacier National Park, where a new trail marker honored Jake Sullivan's service and sacrifice. The plaque mentioned his 18 years as a ranger protecting Montana's wilderness, but not the circumstances of his death. Some details were too painful for public monuments. Thunder was remembered too, in the way that working animals deserve recognition for their service alongside human partners. A bronze statue of a ranger on horseback was installed at the Park Visitor Center, representing all the wilderness professionals who had dedicated their lives to protecting America's natural heritage. As Morrison stood in the Montana clearing, where his investigation had begun, he reflected on the journey from Jake's disappearance to the complete exposure of Project Wilderness. The forest had reclaimed most evidence of the massive search operation, but the embedded horseshoe had changed everything. One impossible detail that had unraveled a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. The wilderness felt different now, quieter, perhaps, as if the forest itself understood that justice had been served for the violence committed in its depths. Wildlife had returned to Sector 7, and rangers reported that the unnatural stillness that had marked the area for 3 years had finally lifted. Morrison's phone contained one final message, received that morning from an encrypted source he recognized as Agent Martinez's backup communication system. The message was brief but significant. Evidence secured, truth protected, justice served, rest in peace. He realized that Martinez had somehow survived the supposed car accident, remaining hidden until the complete exposure of Project Wilderness guaranteed his safety. The agent's survival meant that someone with intimate knowledge of classified programs would continue monitoring for future abuses, serving as a permanent check against programs that might threaten American citizens. Standing in the shadow of the pine tree where Jake's horseshoe had waited 3 years to tell its story, Morrison felt the investigation finally reaching its conclusion. Justice had been served not through conventional law enforcement, but through the stubborn pursuit of truth that refused to accept official explanations when evidence suggested deeper mysteries. Jake Sullivan and thunder were gone, their atoms scattered through the Montana wilderness by weapons that should never have existed. But their deaths had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the constitutional principles of American democracy, and their sacrifice had prevented future tragedies by ensuring that classified programs could never again operate beyond public accountability. The forest kept its secrets, but this time the secret had been worth uncovering. Sometimes justice required more than solving crimes. It required exposing the systems that made those crimes possible and ensuring they could never happen again. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because in America's vast wilderness, there are always more secrets waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, the truth is stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined.